want to welcome you to the Wednesday morning study. And I love your prayer, Chuck. That was from Psalm 90, as we know, and it was it's really worthy of our reflection from time to time because it's so profound. As you can see from the website, the Wednesday morning study archive, which I'd like to call your attention to it because, as you can see, we alternate and have been doing so for quite a long while now, Old and New Testament, through the 365 key chapters of the Bible. And those chapters were selected in Handbook to Scripture. So it's really based upon that. And so we've done Judges 15 2 weeks ago, and we're going to complete our section on Judges by looking at chapter 16 in our study this morning. So that's worth knowing about. So in Judges chapter 16, we're really looking at the seventh cycle of the Judges, and we're in the life of Samson. So before we go to that and actually read the text itself, just to contextualize for any of you who may be joining us for the first time, that there is this whole cycle or chronology of the Judges, and this chronology of the Judges consisted of an array of oppressors and kings. And this would be from about 1406 to 1385. And here we have, was Mesopotamia, Cushan Rishathaim, and then they have the estimated dates and so forth, and who the judge was, which is helpful. We've gone through some of these, and the Moabites then with Eglon, and then the Philistines, and then there was the Canaanites, and then there was the Midianites, and you had associated with that, you had Gideon, and also there was a civil war of Abimelech, then the Ammonites, and then after the Ammonites with Jephthah as one of the key judges, then there was the Philistines, and that's the seventh cycle of judges, and that's where we're dealing with Samson here. And so as we've seen, we go through these cycles, and we've seen, again, another way of looking at it. Here you see their actual locale in the land, so the Amorites and the Ammonites, Moabites, and so forth. Well, here's where the Philistines are. They're so in the area. Some of their key cities were Ashkelon and Gaza. This is where we're dealing with these judges here. And again, we saw a cycle in those seven components, first, second to the seventh cycle. And in each of these seven cycles, we've observed the same monotonous sequence, bringing us from sin to servitude to supplication to salvation, and then concluding with silence. And that the process of God's deliverance was unique in each case, but the sin was so repetitious because it was always the sin of idolatry. And so they were syncretistic in their religion, and they really lost their obedience to the Lord God in this new generation that did not know Joshua. They did not know, remember the Exodus, and they were that next generation who then, because they did not know the works of God, had not seen the works of God, they did not have the faith of that, particularly of that second generation. And so this process of sin then, as we see, was so monotonous because their variations were only which god or gods would they serve. But it would be the gods of the Ammonites, the Amorites, and so forth. And so often would be Moloch and Asherah rather, and violent kinds of worship, as they would have called it, in order to placate the deities and suppose that therefore they would have better crops and better health and all the other kinds of things that they try to do through a mediated religion of their own invention. And so and this is really what human religion has been about since its inception, essentially, is that the God, the one true God, is in fact, for many, so remote, so distant, and they don't want to think about him, but rather they want to invent something of their own management, that they can manage idols of various sorts. And often they would be physical idols of gold or silver or of wood or whatever, but they would actually take a portion of one part and of a log or whatever, and they'd fashion it into a wooden idol, and another they would burn. And so the scriptures continue to say, have your gods ever spoken to you? Have they ever served you? Have you ever done anything? Have they ever moved? And so the constant conflict between the God who is and the God that people want makes all the difference in the world. So there is the God who is, but he's often not the God we want, because the God who is too vast, too great, too unapproachable, it would seem. And without Jesus, so it would be. His transcendence is overwhelming. And as Don Richardson has talked about, he was best known for Peace Child, but he also had this a book about how that God's name was known throughout the world, you see. And in this context here, there'd be a primal name for the one true God. And actually, it does seem that the evidence is that there was a primal monotheism, and then the extra gods were added afterwards. Because if you can placate the deities in any way you want, that's how it would be. I think we do the same kind of things today in much religion, insofar as we then try to have something that we are pursuing and controlling. And so it may not be a god or a demon that's visibly palpable in terms of its representation. Nevertheless, though, it would still be a source of power for many people. And this is when I talk about the seven P's, because then I talk about the idea of how you have these this sequence of things that actually that pull us down, that overwhelm us, that actually cause us to miss out. So these may not be material gods, except for perhaps the possessions, but so many of these things still motivate us, and we serve those deities in a certain way. At any rate, though, we can see that, going back to our theme of the cycles of the judges, then, that the sequence was always so monotonous because it routinely moved from sin, which was idolatry, and then they would serve them until, after a period of time, generally several years, until finally they wised up and realized that this isn't working well for us, and that they would return to the one true God, the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who delivered them out of Egypt and through the Red Sea, the God who preserved them and protected them during the wilderness wanderings, the God who opened up the Jordan River, and that they were able to walk again on dry ground, just as they had done out of Egypt. And so you have this process here where it shows that by signs and wonders, by manifestations, by the manna, the quail, all the things that they'd provided. But again, this generation was forgetting that. And as a consequence, they didn't have that history. And they would therefore be extremely vulnerable to servitude. And then only when they made their call to God, only in their desperation. And it is sometimes the severe mercy of God in our own lives that drives us to him. So that when I speak about severe mercy, I'm speaking about the idea that this is not what you want, but God knows it's what you need. And so it will often be in our setbacks and our failures that he shows up, because then we can only turn upwards. So that when everything is gone on the horizontal, then we are in many ways forced against our desire and against our will to pursue the one thing that we know would endure forever. And so then the supplication is made. And indeed, God delivered them, because they were, in fact, God's covenant people. So this was a theocratic covenant nation, unique in all the world. Never before, never since. This was a unique nation, and it would indeed be the foundation upon which, and the line through which, the Messiah would come. And so we had all those themes then, where it's building up a people, and out of that people then, the one who then takes humanity into himself will be a Jew. And so my best book on that I know still goes way, way back for decades. My friend Arnold Fruchtenbaum wrote a terrific little book called Jesus Was a Jew. He's a Messianic Jew himself. And he speaks about how Yeshua is the fulfillment of all the Messianic prophecies in the Hebrew Bible. And it's quite remarkable. And even to this day, it's kind of evergreen. So but then there would be a period of rest or silence until it would happen all over again. And so Again, another way of looking at through this, the letter R, is that they would rebel against God, and there would be retribution because of their rebellion. And then they'd finally wise up and repent, and then God would restore them. And then there would be a period of rest. Well, in this process, though, we can see that it's so often that they just go around and around, but it's more than just something that's around a circle, but it was actually a descending vortex in which you move further and further into sin, and it became greater and greater. And so it was not a pretty picture. And this is why for the book of Judges, the critical verse for that book is at the very end of the book of Judges, because there we see it tells us that there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And we're actually going to see that expression in our text as well when we look at this last part of the book of Judges. So just to go back to where we were then, if we take a look at in using the daily growth email from a previous year, but they recur on an annual basis. Once again, Samson had a liaison with a Philistine woman because we saw that his fundamental flaw was always that of the lust of the flesh. And so this whole physical allure, this whole component then was always a human a frailty with him. We all struggle in various ways with this, but there's for some for whom it becomes a defining flaw. We all have a kind of a sin pattern. We talked about that before as well when we talked about the various kinds of temptations we could have. Some have a fundamental flaw. It seems to be a kind of a mechanism that keeps recurring. The sin of anger, or they may be inclined to seek revenge, or there may be sexual temptation or coveting, or it could be other forms of fundamental flaws, of addictive behaviors and so forth. And how I, in a previous video, I believe, walked you through how I summon up certain key one-word reminders, so that when I am tempted in one of my fundamental flaws but it's not my deepest self, as I've argued, it's the flesh, not the deepest me, but it's the power of sin in my members, which will be dealt with at the bema of Christ. But there, if I know I have this fundamental flaw, I have then at my disposal come up with a one-word response where I don't have to think. I can train myself to where it becomes more and more continuous rather than something that's occasional. And so if the more I do that, the more, as soon as I summon gratitude, then you cannot be angry and grateful at the same time. Instead of revenge, my quest for justice on my terms, I was not given justice, what I deserve. I was given better, and so we treat others with grace as well, instead of seeking revenge. Instead of sexual temptation, I think of the glory of the God who made this and the glory of the person who is the image bearer. And the goodness of God has to do with coveting, because the coveting question relates to whether God has given us what we really truly need. And we've discovered before, and again, I keep discovering it, that it's what I want is rarely actually what I need. And so when we go back to the material then and pick up where we left off then. So in this case then, it was the context of the Philistines, and that's the seventh cycle. And this was the third chapter on his life. So the miracle of his uprooting and carrying this huge city gate of Gaza over 30 miles to Hebron is understated. It doesn't tell us that it was that far. And they weighed hundreds of pounds. I don't know. It's an understated thing. But some of the achievements, the things he did, are unprecedented and unparalleled in many ways. But again, so with this, he had a liaison with this Philistine woman, and then had another relationship with another Philistine woman. And this was his downfall with Delilah. Persuasive, persistent woman, and that is really characteristic of her. She wouldn't stop manipulating him, and they were offering her a lot of money if they could get him to reveal to her the source of his strength, because they didn't really have any weapons against the supernatural power that he evinced, because when the Spirit would come upon him, he could extricate himself from the worst of situations. So every time Samson would come closer to the truth, and so he would make a final mistake of revealing his true secret, and he then made this false sin of presumption. Once again, God had delivered him in the past. Why wouldn't he deliver him now? But this time, though, it was gone. The Spirit of God had departed from him because of this final flaw. As a consequence, Samson didn't realize that the Spirit had gone. And yet at the same time, Samson was allowed to have a final victory against 3,000 of his enemies. And so in the prayer that I created for this, which is in Hamburg to Scripture, Lord, this tragic story, and it truly is, makes me wonder about the potential of this man. Think about that for a moment. What kind of a man could he have been? It's interesting for us to conceive or think about, had he only stayed with his and kept the Nazirite vows, because he was a Nazirite from his youth. He was to be separate from others in this way. He was not to do certain things that others would do, even cutting his hair. But all that was connected then with a mission and a purpose. But if only he'd been obedient to God, what potential would have happened, would have occurred? And we, of course, can only imagine, because we do not know. We have this situation. But it is often this sin of unused potential. And it's this sin of unused potential that I associate, I think, with the idea of what's going to happen when we stand before the judgment seat of Jesus and give an account before him, before whom all secrets are known. No thoughts are hidden. All desires are known. And so there it becomes explicit and it's revealed. And if we'd only seen what it could have been. And so I don't know whether we see the sin of unused potential. I don't know whether we'll see our sin as he sees it for the first time, but it will not be a light moment in our life. It's in this new life. Here now, we go from death and we're no longer connected. The soul and the body are not connected. And yet at the same time, we are now to be judged before him, but our spirits are already in the heavenly places, and so we're already declared righteous and perfect and pure. Therefore, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Then what is this judgment about? And as we've observed before, it's a judgment of reward. And so the image of all those things that we've built upon the foundation of Christ, which is the superstructure that we're building, and it'll be an amalgam, perhaps an alloy of gold, silver, and precious things on the one hand, those things which were done in the power of the Spirit as we abide in Christ. And on the other hand, it would be those things which were wood, hay, straw. And then it's lit up by fire. It's tested by fire. And of course, you can determine then that those things which were done in the flesh will be eradicated. And again, that unused potential will be there. But at the same time, I think there'll be this sense of holy relief when it's all burned away and we can no longer think sin. So I have mixed feelings about the judgment seat. I want to get rid of all that, but I'm not looking forward to the process. And you've heard me use before this analogy that it's easy to lip sync in the chorus of life, but each one of us will have to sing solo before Jesus. And that's a true image there that we have. So given this idea, think about your obedience and how you want to use the potential that God has given to you, because he's given you potential that he wants you to develop. And so you use, but even here though, often God will use you and me in spite of ourselves and not actually because of our abilities. So the wise person then, even when gifted, is going to not depend upon his knowledge and his gifts, but rather depend upon the Spirit of God in that. And so remember then, as I say, let me remember to walk in your strength and not in my own. So that's a life lesson for us. So we go back to the book of Judges then, and we'll take a look at this chapter. And so we left off then at the end of chapter 15. And we're going to go to here. And so Samson then was again, God protected him, preserved him, and he had many encounters with those who sought to destroy him, and yet he defeated his opponents. I mean, this whole idea of taking the jawbone of a donkey, it is impossible of human attainment. But again, the text emphasizes that dynamic of the power of the living God on him. Now, again, in chapter 16, we see, and remember again, the chapters were not in the text, the verses, nor were the verses. So now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there. So he's still there. He's there in one of the Philistine cities. And he sees this harlot, went into her. And when it was told to the Gazites, saying, Samson's come here, they surrounded the place. They lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. So they were bound and determined to get rid of this menace to them because they could not defeat him. And it was not just an embarrassment, but it was a source of great loss and of life and defeat and so forth. So they surrounded the place, and they kept silent. We're going to wait until the morning light, and then we'll kill him. And he lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose. Don't know how he knew that they were quietly hiding. But at midnight, it says he rose, and he did something that seems, again, it is impossible of human attainment. He took hold of the doors of the city gate. I wish I should have summoned up an image of a city gate from that period. And the two posts, he pulled them up along with the bars, put them on his shoulders, carried him up to the top of the mountain, which is opposite Hebron. What the text doesn't tell us is that from Gaza to that mountain would be about 30 miles. So again, this understatement, it's just full of marvels and wonders. After this, it came about that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And so, again, his fundamental flaw. So the lords of the Philistine want to take what they know is his proclivity and to use it against him. So they wisely offer to use this woman whom he has come to love. And they tell him, they command her, entice him. See where his great strength lies and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So it's a great payment and obviously high degree of motivation there. And so Delilah is a very persistent and a crafty woman. And she keeps on coming at him and keeps on wearing him down. Please tell me where your great strength is and how you may be bound to afflict you. One wonders if Samson really, his mental acuity was no match for his physical acuity, because it's evident that he wasn't figuring something out here. Why is he so interested in this, and why does he keep on playing this game with her? And so there's an array of options, and he narrows it down. First, he starts with 7 fresh cords that haven't been dried. Then I'll be weak. And so what happens, the Lord's brought the 7 fresh cords, bound him. So she binds him with him. So you wonder, what's the man thinking? She had men lying in wait in an inner room. The Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the cords as a string of tows snaps when it touches fire. His strength was not discovered. But wouldn't you think, maybe this isn't a good idea for me to tell her more? Instead, her persistence, he succumbs to that. And so she leverages his love for her as a manipulative ploy so that she can gain. And so now you've deceived me. So she's actually turning around, trying to take the high moral ground. How often does that occur? Playing the victim almost. And he said to him, they bind me tightly with new ropes. Now he's getting one step closer, you see. Now we have ropes. And then the same process, the Philistines. And again, it happens. You'd think he'd say, enough of that foolish game. I see that you're trying to get me. But apparently he didn't put 2 and 2 together. So then up till now, you've deceived me. And she's whining and acting like she's been grievously hurt and injured, as if this was the case. So a third time, this time Now we get to the hair, you see. So we move from one step to another. And it's intriguing how each step gets closer to the actual real source. But it's the locks and pin them with and so forth. So it's still not been cut. But then finally, she again complains to him, whines and manipulates. You don't love me. You've deceived me these 3 times. And then his soul was annoyed to death. And so he foolishly told her all that was in his heart, supposing foolishly that by that revelation that God's going to deliver her. This time he went too far. A razor's never come on my head. I've been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. So you can imagine what he looked like. If I'm shaved, then my strength will leave me and I'll become, and that was a true statement. She knew that she told him the truth. How did he not know that she would know this and what she would do as a consequence? 3 times before she'd done it, but he may still here had the sin of presumption. And in his sin of presumption, he supposed that just as at other times, they will not be able to defeat me. But the mistake here, though, is that she cut his hair, and then the Philistines are upon you, and this time I'll go out as other times and shake myself free. He didn't know that the Lord had departed. That's a frightening word, that the Lord had departed. It's just like a ichabod, the glory had departed. And I've seen this happen more than once in certain ministries as well, where there's a man who has a real anointing from God and is mightily used in his spheres of influence. And then that same man, though, because he succumbs to a wrong thing, whether some kind of act of disobedience. And in one instance, I recall one who had that ability, and he was told that he needed to really nurture his wife rather than to abandon her. And he agreed to do so, but then so foolishly decided not to do so. And in that act of disobedience, it became the last straw, as it were, the final moment. And when that occurred, then his power had gone. He wouldn't know it, and maybe his hearers, and yet you could see, and I remember hearing this individual sometime after that occurred, and I said, the skill is still there, the knowledge is still there, but the power has departed. And that was a chilling reminder and a warning to me, because all of us could succumb. Beware and take heed. If you think you stand, lest you fall. And so it was never returned again. It was a sad moment in his life, and we've seen this again and again, and more frequently, I think, in Christendom, as various ministries topple, and churches and leaders and people who are more about themselves and they're about their ego development than they are about Christ. And they play a good game because they act as if it's something that is really, it's about Jesus, but at the end of the day, it's clearly an extension of the person's ego rather than an extension of him. When you leave, and you have to ask yourself this good question, whatever church you go to, when you leave, are you actually celebrating Jesus or the communicator about Jesus? Are you more concerned or amazed by that skill of a communicator, of a character, of a personality, than you are impressed with the Lord Jesus? Because if you are, there's something wrong. So it really needs to end up with that. Well, here then, in this sad story, he loses everything. The Philistines gouge out his eyes, bring him down to their city, one of the 5 key cities of the Philistines. They bind him with bronze chains. And then he's a grinder in the prison. What a degradation. And so this blind man now, who is now bound, but they didn't realize that the hair of his head began to grow again. And it was like a kind of a source of power that God had connected with that. And there's a mystery to that. I don't try to understand how that was so directly connected in that physicality. But it says how they assembled to make a sacrifice to their god Dagon. And so they were praising their God for giving Samson into their hands. They praised their God. He's given our enemies. And so it happened when they were in high spirits, because they hated him because he'd slain many of them. call for Samson, so we're going to let him amuse them. They call from him from the prison. He entertains them. They make him stand between the pillars. And then we know this story. If you've read much at all about the scriptures, I still remember as a kid going to church, Sunday school class. I didn't know Jesus. I believed about him intellectually, but I didn't really come to know him in a receptive modality. That is to say, I intellectually concluded this is right, but I didn't really come to the point of actually returning from my sin and turning to him by inviting him into my life. And that happened just after college for me. But the point is, I still remember all these flannel graph stories and so forth, and how you would have these images. And I still remember the imagery of Samson and so forth, and the pillars as well. And so we all have this image of him pushing these pillars, and it was a big palace. And it tells us then the pillars were resting. The house was resting, and it was a huge facility because it would hold thousands. So it tells us the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. About 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking while Samson was amusing them. So you think these are not just 3,000. This was their key people in their entire realm, because these were the elites. These were the lords of the Philistine. And so this was a great loss when Samson would be avenged in this way, and that his act in death would actually be achieving more than he'd ever accomplished in his life. So he does make this appeal to God. So the story ends, though it's a tragic sense in the human condition. Nevertheless, he does at the end acknowledge the Lord as God. And he says, please remember me. Please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he braced himself against it. I'd love to see this. I'd love to have the ability to go back and see what these things looked like and how they were. I think of him with the lion and other stories like this. It'd be a marvel to be able to look back and see. Maybe we'll be able to have an ability to do that in some way in the Father's house. I do not know. But I imagine how he embraced himself and the titanic strength that it would require. Think about that. You go into a big building and there's pillars that are close enough to each other. Put your arm and try it out. And you get the idea of how absurd, even the concept of trying it. Yet he depended upon his God in this time, and he did something that he knew was a physical impossibility, and no one could attain it. But he trusted in God in this last act. He grasped them, braced himself, the one with his right hand, the other with his left. And then Samson, in his last words, says, "Let me die with the Philistines." He bent with all his might, so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. The dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Moreover, as I mentioned, this weren't just an ordinary 3,000. This was the elite of that country. Then his brothers and all his father's household came down, and they took him, brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. Because earlier, remember, we recall how Manoah was visited by an angel. And thus he had judged Israel 20 years. Now, Judges is a sad book, and just in the remaining time before we open it up, I would call your attention to the tragic conclusion, because after these 7 cycles of the Judges, then we get into this concluding section that shows the level of degradation and declension to be unparalleled. And we have, first of all, the story of Micah's idolatry, and there's this man who has 1,100 pieces. For some reason, he must be felt bad about it because he stole it from his mother. He returns it. She takes 200 of them and creates this molten image. And so then He returns the silver, and his mother does this, and a graven image, a molten image. They're in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine. He made an ephod and household idols. Isn't that just lovely then? So again, you see, they didn't even give a thought to God in this context. He consecrated one of his sons that he'd become a priest. And what does it say? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did which was right in his own eyes. The very last verse of this book actually appeared before then, right here. But it's so astonishingly vile, these things that we see coming up, that we have to be reminded of that. And so it describes how then a young man who was of the family of Judah, and he was a Levite, and he was staying there. So that in this context, then he was being a Levite, he could actually act as a priest. And so they decide to take him, and he says, "Let me dwell with me and be a father and a priest. I'll give you 10 pieces a year and a suit of clothes." So the Levite wins. So he has his own little personal priest now, you see. I got a Levite. God will take care of me now. Notice he says, God's going to prosper me. So here is again the illustration of religion by manipulating God to say, oh, if I do this, then God's going to honor it. And what is he, so stupid that just because a guy's got a Levite, that God's going to now honor this disbelief and this idolatry? Yet so it is. And so it is as well with us, that we suppose that we can have just enough knowledge so that we can have a better life. It's interesting how people want to know just enough about the scriptures to have a better life, but they don't want to have a changed life, a transformed life, a life that would involve really the true way of the gospel. We want to come to him on our own terms and make that occur. But at any rate, we see this constant pull, this constant lure for us to try to manipulate God in this way. We want the better life. We would rather have the life of that we hope of his promises than the greater life of his presence. It's a terrible loss when we do that. And then the Danites come in. And so, again, it says in those days there was no king of Israel. And then the Danites then want to actually hire this guy and take over. So they come to this house. They recognize the voice of the young man. He was a Levite. Who brought you here? What are you doing here? And so he tells them, inquire how we can know on our way, whether we're going to be prosperous. Again, kind of like an occult reading, almost more than anything else. It's not a relationship with God in the right way. And so that which is you're doing as the Lord's approval. How does he know this? Then the 5 men departed, and they came to, and then they went there, and they did succeed at their attempt. And so arise, let us go up against them, seen the land and so forth. And so they actually then 600 of them, armed with weapons, set out, and they come and they want to take these Michael's idols. And they want him to serve them. So rather than just having this priest then to serve one man, they take him and say, we'll be the one that will take your idols, and the priest's heart was glad because he took the ephod and the household idols and the graven image. He went among the people. So instead of having one now, he thought of that as a definite step up where we'd have a tribe. And so again, we have this strange story, and how one thing after another occurs, and the nature of the sons of Dan, how they set up for themselves. So they named this town, the city Dan, after the Danites. And so they have this graven image. It becomes again a source of sin for all of them. And so they set up for themselves Micah's graven image. So the sin, again, continued idolatry. I won't go into the details in this next chapter, but it's the Levite's concubine who's degraded. So again, it tells us when there was no king of Israel. This is a different Levite. He's staying in Ephraim. Takes a concubine. She plays the harlot. And then her husband arose and then went after her to speak tenderly to bring her back. So what takes place, however, is that he is detained, and he gets to go, and then he's eventually he has to leave at night. And so as a consequence, there's a bit of danger involved. And in fact, what happens is he goes into a house, and he then he wasn't willing to spend the night, so he rose and departed and came to this place. And they were there, and then let's turn into this city of the Jebusites. We're not going to turn inside that city of foreigners. He said to a servant, let's go approach one of these places. So they go to Gibeah. And so they go finally there. So it must be the middle of the night practically. And the sun was very late. The sun had set on them near Gibeah, but it gets later and later. They turned aside and go to lodge there. And they sat down in the open square. Someone takes them in. And the man was from this country. And again, what happens is he is then taken care of. And he provides for them. But while they're celebrating, the men of the city, these worthless fellows, surround the house, and they want to have the concubine, and so want to have the relations. And this horrible story, the man would actually offer his virgin daughter and bring him out that you may ravish him. What kind of a world is this? What kind of a father is this? And so they seize the concubine, they rape her, and at the end, she's ready to die. And in the morning, she has her last words, and she's dead. Get up and let's go, but there was no answer. Then he divides her up into 12 pieces, and they send it throughout the tribes. And then this leads to an intertribal war against the Benjaminites. And so the men of Gibeon rise up against them. And so one story after another, again, without going into detail, the whole most of Benjamin is defeated because of this sin that takes place here in that locale, because they refused to give up the men. There was a civil war that takes place. So the sons of Benjamin came out of Gibeah, and at first they were successful, and again the second time, then they wept. Shall we again go? And the Lord go up against, and again they were defeated. But then the third time, they were actually able to defeat the Benjaminites, and almost all of the Benjaminites, except for a handful of them, were dead. Only a few hundred of them, and so they actually had to they destroyed 25,100 men of Benjamin that day, and so they were defeated, more than defeated. There was only a few hundred of them left, and so what takes place then is that they need to actually, how are they going to, have we lost a city, a tribe rather? 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness, and they allowed those people then to actually marry some of the women, take some of the women who would be at this festival. So they provided for them so that they would be able to then at least continue their tribe. So they turned back against the sins of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, both this entire city with the cattle and all which they'd found. And then they're mourning this lost tribe. But that's when they provide for their survival and send these men there and provide a vehicle by which these daughters of Shiloh would come out and take place. And so they allowed them to return to their inheritance and rebuild the cities with that small amount. And they built back the tribe. Again, the last verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So there's a tragic summary, but you can see the next book that we're going to be looking at. Ruth is a cameo of beauty and goodness and truth in a context of great evil and degradation. So what you see in these cycles of the judges is also illustrated at the very end of the book with this moral declension that is almost unbounded and unprecedented, that you see. So you very rarely see this kind of thing in literature. A man sending out 12 parts of his ravished concubine throughout the tribes to get them to come against the city, and all the horrors that ensue, the death, the degradation, the destruction, that's as a consequence of sin and of disobedience, the consequence of turning to the gods of men's imagination, of their own machination. They make it out of their own hands and then say, deliver me because you're my God, because they refuse to acknowledge the one true God who delivered them, because they cannot see him. He seems too remote. And this, it is always so, that men will treasure what's visible, what's in front of their eyes, more than what is unseen. They will treasure what is now rather than the hope of God's promises for what's to come. And as a consequence, then, even when we're believers, we're going to be tempted in many ways then to succumb to this folly of treasuring the unseen, the visible over the invisible, to treasure that which we know is passing away, that which is ephemeral. How many more decades do you have left? And if you're smart, you won't think of them as many. And the realization, even if you have 10 decades in this earth, it's like a vapor. And then what will you pursue? You know everything you're going to leave behind. What is it that you can send ahead? How can we build in now for eternity? And that to me is really a great challenge for us all, is for us to treasure the things that are going to endure over the things that we know for sure will perish. My last thought on this before we open this up comes to mind, and it's really a psalm. And in Psalm 39, I'm reminded of this idea here. If you go to Psalm 39, where it talks about the vanity of life and so forth. Lord, make me to know my end, and what is the extent of my days? Let me know how transient I am. Behold, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my lifetime as nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere breath, salah. It's a musical term, a pause, a rest. Reflect, meditate on that. Remember that. Understand, live in light of the fact that this could be your last night. Because how can you presume and be so arrogant as to suppose you have any guarantee of another day in this world? Every man walks about as a phantom. Surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches and doesn't know who's going to gather them. But then the psalmist says, and now, Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. And there is that transitional point. And that would be wise for us to all say, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. It's not in my possessions, not in my portfolio. My hope is not in people in my life or my family. My hope is not in my notoriety or my accomplishments. My hope must be only in the one thing that's going to give true hope that'll sustain and endure. So we'll stop there.
Dr. Ken.
Yes.
Since Larry Crabb's passing,
yes.
His son, especially Cap, has put out some videos about his dad. And he said one of the last times that they had a dinner or something together, that his dad kind of said, what is the one sin that is common among all of mankind that we all have together? And he said something to the effect that it's the sin that we all want to be the God of our own lives. We all want to determine what is right and what is wrong. And it kind of goes back to that phrase that every man in Israel did that which was right in his own eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also the sin that Adam and Eve committed in the Garden of Eden when they partook of the fruit, that they wanted to determine for themselves what was right, what was wrong, and to be in control instead of God.
I think that's correct.
And just your comments on that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And everyone has this problem because it's the fundamental sin. The root sin is always pride. It's the one that unites all the others. And pride comes out of an egocentric orientation that we all want to be the masters of our own little worlds, our own fiefdoms. Some people's worlds are bigger than others, but at the end, it's this mindset. Even when we were toddlers, we thought that we were the center of all things, and that our siblings and our parents were orbiting around us. It's like this paradigm shift that I so often use. The fundamental paradigm shift, as you know, was moving from a Ptolemaic or geocentric world in which the Earth was the center of the solar system, and you could see the planets revolving about it. And that radical change from there to the Copernican revolution, in which the sun, not the Earth, is at the center. And so you can see this as an obvious spiritual analogy as well, because all of us need to have a kind of a Copernican revolution in which we go from instead of a geocentric, it's an egocentric, to a theocentric or Christocentric world, you see. And but the problem is having made that revolution, that understanding, that whole heliocentric paradigm, once that took place, well, it was not reversible. We don't go back to that. But sadly, in our situation, a lot of these things are quite reversible. That some of these images here, that they can go both ways, and so I've often used this image of a reversible image, because here you have really two things. And if you look closely at this image, is it an old woman or is it a young woman? And I bet some of you will see one or the other. Some will see both, but you can't see them both at the same time. You can go shift back and forth. Here is the young woman's cheek and her jaw. Here's her eyelash. Here's her ear. But if you undo that instead, and want to see the old woman, this is her nose. This would be the woman's nose here. That's her mouth. That's her eye. So again, once you've seen it, you can see. I can go back and forth, but I can't see them quite at the same time. You see, it's. So in our context, then, this revolution, this Copernican revolution, is reversible. So we need to actually see it in that orientation. What paradigm are we using? Which way are we seeing? So are we going to see the world from as it really is, from God's vantage point, or we're going to see it as we want it to be, from our vantage point? And that is the awful truth of what you've just described here. That at the end, it is not my will, but your will be done. And that's why it's necessary for us also to do a thing that's very important. And I often think of it with the Lord's Prayer, and I've shown you this multiple times before, but this is important. When you slowly say the Lord's Prayer, Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, what you're really saying is you're focusing more on God's name and his reputation than you are on yours. The world is not about my kingdom, but your kingdom come, not my sphere of authority. Your will be done, not my intentions or desires. So again, that prayer said slowly and consciously and thoughtfully is a kind of a way of making that revolution again from an ego to a Christo or theocentric world. That's always a fundamental question, though. Yeah, that's the basic flaw that we all have. Is this issue of, is it about me or not? I can't get rid of me. And that's the problem. You see, it's always with me. And so you're so concerned if you're not careful. You have to train yourself, though, when you're with people, when you're working on projects. What's the most important thing? Is it what people think? Or is it what the true master thinks? Because I will give an account. And there's nothing that I have that wasn't given to me. And that becomes then the overcoming of pride is the realization that everything you are and have is God's gift and grace.